My name is Muhammad Hambal Khan, and I will start the presentation by the history of British Empire. The British Empire began to take shape during the early 17th century with the English settlement of North America and the smaller islands of Caribbean and the establishment of giant stock companies, most notably the East India Company, to administer colonies and oversee trade. This period until the loss of the 13 colonies after the American War of Independence towards the end of the 18th century has been referred by some historians as the First British Empire. First British Empire was largely destroyed by loss of American colonies followed by a swing to the east and the foundation of Second British Empire based on commercial and territorial expansion. The Third British Empire was the construction of a wide dominion power bloc in the international system based on Britain's relation with its better offshoots Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa. The Fourth British Empire, meanwhile, is used to denote Britain's rejuvenated imperial focus on Africa and Southeast Asia following the Second World War and the independence in 1947 of Britain's South Asian dependencies when the empire became a vital crutch in Britain's economic recovery. Now we talk about demographics, territory, and religion of the British Empire. The British Empire is a term used to describe all the places around the world that were once ruled by Britain. Built over many years, it grew to include large areas of North America, Australia, New Zealand, Asia, and Africa, as well as small parts of Central and South America too. The other thing is population. At first, population was 88 million, but by 1922, however, following the acquisition of the additional territories, the figure had grown to some 458 billion, which was about 23% of the world population at that time. Regarding religion, people followed Christianity and spiritualism, but it was widely accepted in Britain that the Protestant Christianity was the superior religion and that British culture and government were the superior forms of life and rule. Now, nationalism. The idea emerged across the empire that British states opposed imperialism and demanded for a self-rule dependencies. British Commonwealth focus on intergovernmental aspects. Member states have no legal obligations to one another but are connected through their use of the English language and historical ties.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Bisma Tariq. Today the topic that I am going to present is World War I and its impact on British Empire. So basically, World War was a war that started in Europe on 28 July 1914 till 11 November 1918. There were two groups in World War One. The allies of War One or Entente powers were the coalition of countries led by France, Britain, Russia, Japan against the Central Powers of Germany. Identity in Europe, various groups identified themselves as being part of a particular national entity, each trying to prove their dominance over the other. Nationalism increased the desire for major economic powers to establish themselves as economic and military powers within Europe. After First World War, the British economy was in surplus and things looked very rosy indeed because of the way the empire was configured. After the war, with all Commonwealth countries having made incredible contributions and sacrifices, things were not the same, which led in turn to the dissolution of the empire after the Second World War. The next topic that I'm going to present is World War II and its impact on British Empire. World War II, also known as the Second World War. Causes of World War II. There are several causes that led to the deadliest war in the human history. One was the Treaty of Versailles and the desire for revenge. Hitler was able to ascend to power in Germany in part because he was successful in tapping the anger of the German people in responses to the terms for their surrender in the First World War. The cause of the World War II is the failure of appeasement. One leader of the Western powers, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, believed that he could placate Adolf Hitler by appeasing him, thus allowing the Nazi dictator to take a small bit of territory in Czechoslovakia without provoking a war and getting Hitler to promise that future territorial disputes will be resolved through non-violent means. But just a few months later, Hitler broke his promise and seized all of Czechoslovakia. Another cause of World War II is rise of dictators and their imperialist ambitions. Before World War II began, two men took power in the countries of Germany and Italy. One was Benito Mussolini, who became Prime Minister of Italy in 1922. The other was Adolf Hitler, who became the Chancellor of Germany in 1938. In just a short time, the two men turned their countries to tyrannical dictatorships. Mussolini saw the restoration of the Roman Empire, while Hitler saw the formation of a new German Empire, the Third Reich, which he wanted to stretch from the Ural Mountains in the east. All the impact of World War II on Britain's economy. From 1945, Britain experienced an economic decline, accentuated by the conclusion of World War II. The United Kingdom's economic growth had been weakening since the 1870s.
Welcome, my name is Syed Qaim Ali Shah and I am going to present the topic Administrative System of the Britain Empire. The administrative system of the Britain Empire was a complex structure. It was complex structure, but it was the most streamlined one. Let's have a video for the better understanding of the administrative system of the Britain Empire. 1927 to 1951, chief clerk also with the colonial military forces, predominantly the King's African Rifles and the Royal West African Frontiers. These include records on the organization and the administration of the forces, but not the personal information on those who served. The British colonies were initially administered jointly by the Secretary of the State for the War and the Board of the Trade, who were focused on their interests, not necessarily the colonies themselves. The British Empire was composed of the dominions, colonies, protectorates, mandates, and the other territories ruled or administered by the United Kingdom and its predecessor states. King or the Queen of the England was considered as the sovereign of the Britain Empire. After the king or the queen, the major role game players or the major players of the administration of the Britain was the senior government officers, senior military leadership, and some rich businessmen or the wealthy businessmen. And the rest of the hierarchy is as follows.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Muhammad Suleiman. Today the topic of my presentation is the economy and social status of the British Empire. British income per capita was the world's third trade, finance and shipping and had strong bases in manufacturing and mining. To raise vital funds for the war effort, taxation also increased. By 90s, the United States and Germany had experienced industrialization on the scale comparable to that achieved in United Kingdom and were also developing large-scale manufacturing companies. Britain's cooperative economic advantage had lessened. The city of London remained the financial and commercial capital of the world until challenged by the New York after 1918. After the end of World War II, the British economy had again lost huge amounts of absolute wealth. Its economy was driven entirely for the needs of war and took some time to the reorganized for peaceful production. Britain's economic position was relatively strong compared to its devastated European neighbors in 1940. And the second part is social status of British Empire. The social status of the United Kingdom has historically been highly influenced by concept of social class, which continues to affect British society today. British society, like its European neighbors and most societies in world history, and was traditionally divided hierarchically within a system that involved the hereditary transmission of occupation, social status, and political influence. Since the advent of industrialization, this system has been in a constant state of revision, and new factors other than birth, for example, education, are now greater part of creating identity in Britain. The complex British middle classes had also been enjoying a long period of growth and increasing prosperity and achieving political power at the national level to a degree unusual in Europe. They avoided the strict stratification of many continental middle classes and formed a large and shapeless group closely connected at their edges with the both gentry and aristocracy and the laboring classes. In particular, the great financial center of the city of London was open to outsiders to an unusual degree and continually expanding and creating new employment.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Rimsha Rana, and the topic I'm going to present today is military powers and the impact of modern world.
Colonies broke free from Britain through the American War of Independence, creating the United States of America. Despite this seemingly crushing blow, the British Empire pushed forward and shifted its focus toward Asia, the Pacific, and Africa, growing larger than ever.
The British Army was greatly increased in size by conscription during World War I, but was reduced to a minimum with an end to conscription after 1919. In July 1939, however, conscription was again enforced. Major changes in the British Army occurred after 1945. Troop stations overseas were returned home as the British colonies gained independence, and the military forces were placed in Europe or absorbed into the Home Guard. In 1960, conscription was ended and all volunteer army again created. With the introduction of nuclear weapons, the territorial army was greatly reduced. In 1964, the Ministry of Defense was established to administer all the armed forces. The Army has three main artillery systems: the Multi-Launch Rocket System (MLRS), the AS-90 and the L118 light gun. The MLRS, first used in Operation Granby, has an 85-kilometer range. The AS-90 is a 155mm self-propelled armored gun with a 24-kilometer range. Next is aviation. The Army Air Corps AAC provides direct aviation support, with the Royal Air Force providing support helicopters. The primary attack helicopter is the Westland WAH-64 Apache, a license-built, modified version of the US AH-64 Apache, which replaced the Westland Lynx AH-7 in the anti-tank role. The next topic is impact of modern world. The British Empire has had a huge impact on the world. The majority of the former colonies still keep their ties with the Britain through the Commonwealth. Today, North America and Australia are very similar to Europe in a lot of ways. Many countries around the world now have multicultural population. The British Empire was one of the most important developments in the world history. The empire was huge, it lasted a long time, and it brought tremendous changes to many parts of the world. For millions of the people of the world is the way it because of the impact of the British Empire. It is today because of the empire, from the way it looks, to the sports people play, from the religion we practice, and to the language we speak.
Decolonization, a process by which colonies become independent of the colonizing country. Decolonization was gradual and peaceful for some British colonies, largely settled by expatriates, but violent for others, where native rebellions were energized by nationalism. After World War II, European countries generally lacked the wealth and political support necessary to suppress faraway revolts. They also faced opposition from new superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, both of which had taken positions against colonialism. Britain left subcontinent in 1947, Palestine in 1948, and Egypt in 1956. It withdrew from Africa in the 1950s and 60s, from various island protectorates in the 1970s and 80s, and from Hong Kong in 1997. Colonization after 1945. The reason why decolonization took place are many and complex, varying widely from one country to another. Three key elements played a major role in the process. Number one, colonized people thirst for independence. Number two, The Second World War, which demonstrated that colonial power were no longer invulnerable. Number three, and a new focus on anti-colonialism in international arenas such as the United Nations. Furthermore, the emergence of two anti-colonialist superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, and the new international climate after 1945 encouraged the colonies to make a bid for independence. The Charter of United Nations affirmed its respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of people. The American President Franklin Roosevelt and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had already subscribed to this principle in the Atlantic Charter. The process of decolonization coincided with the new Cold War between the Soviet Union and United States and with the early development of new United Nations. Decolonization was often affected by superpower competition and had a definite impact on the evolution of that competition. How did the Cold War and decolonization shape the post-war world? From the Cold War, India and Pakistan became independent, Israel was established as a state, and China had a communist revolution. These events reflected tendencies like decolonization, revolution.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Hafsa Amir. The topic I am going to present is weaknesses of British Empire which led them to the fall.
One is culture. British culture was forced onto colonists while the original culture was banned, ignored, and forgotten. Second is economies. The colonies' economy was falling because most of profit of goods go back to Britain. Soldiers. The colonies have had to provide soldiers who fought and died for Britain. As long as the war continued, the colonists' claim continued to gain validity. The geographic vastness of the colonies proved a hindrance to British effort. Despite occupying every major city, the British remained at a disadvantage. Some other weaknesses includes Britain withdrawal from India in 1947, British defeat in Europe and Asia, which ended its financial and economic independence, lost colony of military muscle east of Suez. One of the major reasons of fall was Commonwealth. Over time, different countries of British Empire gained different levels of freedom from Britain. They all owed allegiance to the British king or queen, but United Kingdom did not rule over them. The community was called the British Commonwealth of Nations or just Commonwealth. Nationalism and imperialism was one of the main reasons. British nationalism is closely associated with British unionism, which seek to uphold the political union. That military and economic tensions between Britain and Germany were major cause of First World War, during which Britain relied heavily on its empire. The Suez Crisis confirmed Britain's decline. When the growth of British Empire started, many new foods and very rare material were new to Britain. They were traded all over the world. The empire provided Britain with reliable sources of food and raw material and a captive market for British exports. On the downside, people living in countries taken into empire often lost lands and suffered discrimination and prejudice. Countries in the empire were also exploited for their raw materials. Slavery was another negative impact because despite the enormous profits made, the suffering of the slaves were terrible. This slide shows flags of British Empire. These are the territories which were separated from Britain in the history, due to which they led to the fall.